Greetings all. I hope everyone is doing well today. I want to take this opportunity to welcome all of our attendees to today's webinar on protecting homes during extreme weather. My name is Christopher Walker, Senior Program Analyst for the National Environmental Health Association, and we are excited to host and bring to you the second webinar in our series of 3, identifying the effects of extreme weather events when it comes to climate change and the linkage to health inequities as it intensifies existing disparities for safe, healthy, and affordable housing. This second webinar will draw attention to the impact of extreme heat and extreme cold. Through funding from the Centers of Disease Control and Prevention, we are pleased to be working on this project with the National Center for Healthy Housing. We continue our collaboration on project activities with the focus on improved housing and health, as we both believe that a healthy home is important for everyone. Our partnership continues to strengthen as we will continue to work together on identifying gaps and develop resources to meet the needs of protecting housing and health during extreme weather. In our upcoming webinar, we hope to share some of these resources with you. Next slide. A few housekeeping items for today's webinar. You should have the chat function available to ask questions. We will gather these questions and ask in the Q&A portion after the presenters. Also, there will be a survey shared at the end of this webinar, and we would greatly appreciate letting us know your thoughts on this webinar. Now I am going to hand things over to Anna Planky of the National Center for Healthy Housing to talk a little more about today's webinar, as well as introduce our first speaker. Anna?
Great, thanks, Chris. Go ahead, next slide. So as Chris mentioned, my name is Anna. I'm with the National Center for Healthy Housing. And before we jump into our speakers' presentations, I just want to talk a little bit more about this webinar series and about the project. So we're hosting 3 webinars in a series on protecting homes during extreme weather. The goal of this webinar series is to share information about the impacts of weather events on housing and health. We also aim to highlight new resources, policies, and strategies to protect homes before, during, and after these extreme weather events. So today is the second in our series. The third and final webinar will be held in July, and we'll be exploring the topics of climate resiliency and healthy homes. Go ahead, next slide. As Chris mentioned in the opening, this project is a collaboration between NCHH, NEHA, and CDC. So during this project, our goal is to compile, share, and create new resources on climate change and extreme weather events, and particularly how they're relevant to healthy homes. We also want to make sure to highlight and focus on environmental justice, health equity, and also on the populations and communities that are most affected by the changing climate. Lastly, our goal is to identify needs where public health and healthy housing professionals can assist and bridge gaps through creating resources, facilitating connections, or just amplifying and disseminating information that already exists. Next slide. So here we have our funding acknowledgement, again, just highlighting this partnership and collaboration between NCHH, NEHA, and CDC, and then of course the content disclaimer. Next slide. So next, I just want to provide a quick recap and some grounding context that we discussed in webinar 1, and just to get us all on the same page. So generally, we need homes to be safe and healthy because we know that Americans spend over 70% of their time at home. In addition, homes need to be a safe refuge to protect residents during extreme weather events. So for example, it's critical to have safe indoor air quality during wildfires and significant smoke events. We also know that other kinds of disasters like flooding as a result of hurricanes or other severe storms can exacerbate unhealthy conditions or destroy homes entirely and leave people without a safe place to live. Next slide. Lastly, I just want to make a couple of distinctions here between mitigation and adaptation. So climate mitigation refers to efforts to reduce or slow the causes of climate change. A healthy housing example of this is making homes more energy efficient and reducing energy usage and needs. Climate adaptation refers to efforts to improve our ability to withstand current effects of climate change. So a healthy housing example of this is providing retrofits to homes to better withstand extreme weather events and to protect resident health. This webinar series will primarily focus on adaptation, but both approaches are necessary and interconnected. Next slide. So with that, it's my great pleasure to now introduce Dr. Natasha DeJarnett, who will be moderating and our first speaker today. Dr. Natasha DeJarnett is an assistant professor in the Christina Lee Brown Environment Institute at the University of Louisville, Division of Environmental Medicine, researching the health impacts of extreme heat exposure and environmental health disparities. In addition, she is a professorial lecturer in environmental and occupational health at the George Washington University Milken Institute of Public Health. Previously, Dr. DeJarnett was Interim Associate Director of Program and Partnership Development at the National Environmental Health Association, leading research, climate and health, and children's environmental health. She also previously served as a policy analyst at the American Public Health Association, or APHA, where she led the natural environment portfolio, including air and water exposures, along with climate change. Dr. DeJarnett is a member of EPA's Children's Health Protection Advisory Committee, is chair of the Governing Board of Citizens Climate Education, a president-elect of the Board of Directors of Physicians for Social Responsibility, chair-elect for APHA's Environment Section, member of the advisory board of APHA's APHA's Center for Climate Health and Equity, a member of the Board of Trustees for the BTS Center, special advisor to the Environmental Health and Equity Collaborative, and a steering committee member of the International Transformational Resilience Coalition. So with that, I will now turn it over to you, Natasha. Go ahead.
Thank you so much. I am so grateful for the opportunity to be here. Next slide, please. Thank you for the kind introduction, and a special thanks to the National Environmental Health Association and the National Center for Healthy Housing for putting a spotlight on climate through the lens of housing. Next slide, please. So before I delve into heat and heart disease, I'd love to share with you just a little bit about our research center. I'm part of the Christina Lee Brown Envirome Institute, which is in the Division of Environmental Medicine at University of Louisville. And our center fills a void through our framework to understand the environment as a whole through our interactions between the natural, social, and personal domains. And this is what we describe as the Envirome. So to understand how the environment increases or decreases risk of developing heart disease, for example, we must understand the impact of the environment at specific domains on health. So on the screen, you'll see that I've included the citation of our foundational article, which was published when our center was established in 2018 for you to have more information. The Envirome Institute is complete with 7 collaborative research centers, and we partner among and across disciplines and with the community to understand the environmental burdens of disease and identify interventions to improve health and quality of life. Next slide, please. So the health threats of climate change are vast. And one key takeaway I would love for us to keep in mind during today's conversation is that although we're all at risk to the health threats of climate change, there are some groups that are more vulnerable to these health threats, and climate change can actually be a threat multiplier for these populations, exacerbating some of the inequities that these groups are already experiencing. There are a number of reasons why children are uniquely burdened, but their organ systems are still developing. So exposure at sensitive times in development can have short or long-term consequences on their health. They also breathe in more air, take in more water for their body weight, leaving them more exposed. And children are also dependent on adults to make decisions for their well-being, which definitely is an important consideration when it comes to extreme heat exposure. They also crawl on the ground. They have these hand-to-mouth behaviors that put them at greater risk of exposure to ground level pollutants or for ingesting toxins. And lastly, they can be exposed through chemical exposures that can travel through the breast milk or those that can cross the placenta. Older adults have more chronic diseases that render them more susceptible to the health threats of climate change, and impoverished communities, they may lack the resources to protect health during an extreme heat event. Their housing may be less resilient, may lack air conditioning or other protective factors, and then they also may have limited access to needed healthcare services and in the event of extreme heat events. Communities of color are more likely to live on the fence lines of industrial polluters, and the strongest predictor of where hazardous polluters are located is race. It's not income, it's not other factors, but race. And people of color make up the majority of people living within 3 kilometers of a hazardous waste facility. But put this in combination with the fact that people of color are also more likely to live in urban heat islands and experience urban heat island effect, further compounding these exposures. Indigenous communities have close cultural and religious ties to the land, and climate, in particular, extreme heat and drought, are affecting their ability to hunt and gather food from the land and pass along religious and cultural traditions. And where there is the threat of extreme heat, people without access to air conditioning may need to find relief in a cooling center or somewhere where they can go outside of the home to access air conditioning or cool off. However, people with a disability may have challenges in visiting a cooling center if there are more mobility challenges that exist. Undocumented residents may not feel comfortable visiting a cooling center following or during an extreme heat event for fear of deportation or otherwise. And similarly, members of the LGBTQ+ community may not feel comfortable seeking out cooling centers if they fear discrimination. So I share these unique burdens experienced across these different populations and society because we cannot fully and truly address climate change if our most vulnerable don't benefit from climate action. Therefore, we can't meaningfully address climate change without addressing justice, and even our most well-intentioned efforts to affect climate change will be undermined if justice isn't at the center. Next slide, please. So in the 2016 U.S. Climate and Health Assessment, the U.S. Global Change Research Program reported that climate change has increased the severity and frequency and duration of extreme heat events. And this is quite concerning because heat is a top cause of natural weather-related death in our nation. And extreme heat increases our risk of heat-related illness, which can include heat strokes. And heat strokes can be deadly if they're not addressed quickly. Further, it raises our risk of heart and lung complications. And I'll speak more about heart complications in the coming slides. But there are also mental health impacts, including increased violence and aggression that occurs in extreme heat conditions. And then extreme heat can even render inactive some of our psychotropic medications. Some of the populations most sensitive to extreme heat include older adults. They're more likely to have chronic disease, more likely to also be experiencing social isolation. So they may not be aware that there's an extreme heat event. They may not know that they need to find a place to cool off, a cooling center or otherwise. Children spend more time outdoors and they don't really have the capacity to know when they've overdone it, when they need to stop, cool off, take a break, drink some water. So this leaves children more vulnerable when there's an extreme heat event. Communities of color and impoverished communities are more likely to live in urban heat islands, and EPA has reported that urban heat islands can be 20 degrees hotter at night compared to surrounding areas. So those times where we really have the opportunity and need to cool off, those communities can still be 20 degrees hotter than the surrounding areas. And then other people that are more sensitive when it comes to extreme heat, consider people that work outdoors, people that work in agriculture and construction. And these populations are also rendered more vulnerable through extreme heat. Next slide, please. So this image shows the observed changes in temperature and precipitation in the US due to climate change with 1991 through 2012 compared to 1901 to 1960. And we can see that the average temperature has increased 1.3 to 1.9 degrees Fahrenheit since the record keeping began. The warming has been greatest in the north and west, while some parts of the southeast haven't experienced quite as much change. Next slide, please. So here, Perkins and colleagues demonstrate the length of heat waves are increasing, and the figure that's labeled HWD at the top, or heat wave days. They also provide evidence in the second figure that the peak magnitude, or the hottest events of these heat waves, is also increasing. So this provides evidence on the length of heat waves extending, as well as the intensity of heat waves. And next slide, please. And so for further evidence, this figure comes from the Lancet Countdown on Climate and Health US brief. The brief focuses on different indicators each year. So this is from 2018, and heat was a key indicator utilized that year. So using data from the US Global Change Research Program, they provided added evidence that of the increase in heat wave frequency and the length of heat wave season. And you can see both steadily increasing in the figures here. So heat waves in the US are lasting longer. And when you compare 2000 through 2011 compared to 1986 to 2005 as a baseline, the length of heat wave season has increased 3.6 days. Next slide, please. And then also from the fourth National Climate Assessment, these maps show estimated changes in the net mortality due to extremely hot or extremely cold days in 49 US cities. And across these cities, the change in mortality for the high scenario is expected to be 9,300 deaths per year compared to 3,900 additional deaths per year in the lower scenario. Next slide, please. So heat waves increase mortality risk. It also exacerbates disparities. So last year I had the privilege of sitting on a panel to discuss a documentary film that's called Cooked. And I will tell you with all honesty, watching the film Cooked changed my life. And the film, through documentary style, showed that the Chicago heat wave was not just about heat. It's about inequities. It was about structural racism that further multiplies these threats in populations largely based on where they live, which is largely associated with race and ethnicity. So if you take a look at the images here, the blue shading on the graph shows the time of the heat wave. So that blue shading is the heat wave period from the Chicago 1995 heat wave. On the graph, you'll see the average deaths are shown in orange. And so that's what you would expect to see during that time frame based on previous years. The green shading, or the green line, I should say, indicates the temperatures. And then the red line indicates the heat wave deaths. And so, or the heat related deaths. So we can see that there's a correlation between the temperature and the heat related deaths, and that this is well above the expected number of deaths at the time. Now, if you look at the table to the right, the table indicates a disproportionate amount and impact that the heat wave had on the elderly. And then also that race and ethnicity specific rates also increase with age. So just for reference, people 65 and older in the Chicago heat wave accounted for 72% of the heat related deaths that occurred during this heat wave. Next slide, please. And so, bear with me a moment. So what we learned from the Chicago heat wave was the connection also to cardiovascular mortality. And so if you look at this second graph, mortality in the green shaded line is the green shaded line, I'm sorry, mortality is the green shaded area. The maximum daily temperatures are the dashed line during the Chicago heat wave. And then the red line depicts the deaths from cardiovascular diseases alone. And you can see how this corresponds very closely with the green shaded mortality. And so it really uncovered not only the inequities and disparities in the population, but also this strong connection between heat and cardiovascular disease mortality. And in the next slide, I'll share with you just a little more information about this. Next slide. Thank you. So the main outcome of interest in the study that I'm going to share with you that we're doing here in Louisville is heart disease. And it is vitally important to study heart disease because cardiovascular disease is the top cause of morbidity and mortality in the US, where one person dies every 36 seconds from cardiovascular disease. And heart disease, indirect and direct costs are among the most expensive conditions in the US, topping $363 billion annually. Here in Kentucky, our cardiovascular disease mortality rate ranks among the highest in the nation, making it pertinent to study heart disease impact and prevention here. If you could animate, please. Perfect. So in a morbidity and mortality weekly report in 2020, CDC's Climate for Health program reported on heat-related deaths in the US. So the table to the right shows the top underlying cause of heat-related death. And you can see that cardiovascular disease is the underlying cause of 49%, or nearly half of heat-related deaths in the US. Next slide, please. So again, this first figure comes from that same CDC morbidity and mortality weekly report, and their results demonstrate a disparity in terms of heat-related deaths in the US. So their results show that whites or Caucasian have the highest number of deaths, but if we look closer to the rates, American Indians have the highest death rate where it comes to extreme heat or heat-related illness, I should say. So I wanted to highlight a population that's uniquely susceptible to extreme heat. But then in the second figure, another susceptible population here in the US are non-US citizens. So this study was published in the American Journal of Public Health Special Supplement on Climate Change and Environmental Justice, and they examined heat-related deaths by citizenship status. And so in this visual abstract, this comes from the paper that reports that there were 96% of the deaths were among non-US citizens, while only 4% were among US citizens. And so because of this stark difference, you may not have actually realized that you're seeing a bar graph on this visual abstract between the 96% and 4%. But this is highlighting a key population susceptible to heat-related death, and in a time where extreme heat exposure is increasing. Next slide, please. So further, in exploring vulnerabilities to heat, what renders some populations susceptible is the simple concept that place matters. So where you live in terms of the amenities that are available to you, the built environment features that support your health, this contributes to your ultimate health outcomes as well. So here in the images that are shown on the screen, researchers explored the relationship between redlining, or the historical practice of refusing home loans or insurance to whole neighborhoods based on racially motivated perceptions of safety for investment. This has been overlaid with present day summertime intra-urban land surface temperatures. And so the red boxes, I should say, indicate the formerly redlined communities. And you can see that these formerly redlined communities experience higher surface temperatures across the nation in each region. In addition, the researchers utilized this tree cover index, or NDVI, to identify that the formerly redlined communities also have less tree canopy, which can be protective against heat and pollution exposure. So put a bookmark there as I come back to share with you about our interventional study here in Louisville. But next slide, please. So as I shared before, these urban heat islands can be up to 20 degrees hotter at night. And when we consider the factors that render our communities more susceptible, for example, communities that have an abundance of concrete or blacktop, this absorbs heat. Communities that have lower ventilation, they may have tall buildings and urban canyons that don't allow as much ventilation through the city. Vehicles and air conditioners that also contribute to heat. So places that have a lot of traffic, that contributes further to heat. And all of this absorbed heat can contribute to having little relief even at night. So this just continues to build and build. Further, socioeconomic status and the presence of health disparities can make these factors even more burdensome. And then when we add climate change to this burden, as climate is increasing the frequency and intensity of extreme heat events, we certainly have a situation that needs our attention to addressing urban heat island effect. Next slide, please. So I've shared with you a lot of likely very depressing statistics, but there's much that's being done to adapt to extreme heat in communities across the US. There's certainly education of educating populations of what to do when there's an extreme heat event, encouraging people that have to work outdoors to wear lightweight clothing, but also to be able to protect themselves from the sun UV rays as well. In addition, there's much surveillance that takes place through the environmental health workforce. Definitely disseminating alerts are key aspects of helping populations to adapt to the health threats of climate change. But that means that our alerts need to be received by all and need to be widely accessible. But then there are also factors including green infrastructure that's taking place. Like, for example, there's research that supports increasing tree canopy in Phoenix. Changing built forms like replacing pavement with buildings is also taking place, and having buildings that have cool roofs that reflect the sun's rays instead of traditional roofs that absorb the sun rays also provide benefit as well. But I'd love to share with you about a project that we have taking place here in Louisville. Next slide, please. So one of our answers to cardiovascular disease prevention and improving air quality, and also may have benefits on improving our exposure to heat, is the Green Heart Project. And this project is supported by the National Institute of Environmental Health Sciences and the Nature Conservancy, along with several other partners in the community. And this study is a randomized controlled trial where trees are the intervention. So we're planting trees for healthier air, and we're examining health and air quality before and after tree planting. So tree planting started in October of 2021 and will finish this summer. And what we're hoping is that Green Heart will provide the opportunity to establish roots as a healthier and greener neighborhood. Next slide, please. So Louisville has one of the fastest growing urban heat island effects in the US. We also have been rated of having the worst air quality in the state. So we have quite a bit to grapple with, and both have direct links to cardiovascular disease risk. But tree cover, which is the heart of the Green Heart study, can not only reduce air pollution exposure, but it also can cool surface temperatures. So we're going to be assessing greenness across Louisville. We're looking at certainly exposures to volatile organic compounds and cardiovascular disease risk here. But to add to our air quality assessment, we'll also be examining temperature exposures. And this is through supplemental funding that I'm receiving from the National Institute of Environmental Health Sciences. So we're going to be examining temperatures in a number of ways, certainly the high temperatures, understanding that relationship, but there's also temperature variability that's associated with climate change and health outcomes. So we'll also examine temperature variability within our Green Heart community and work to understand this relationship, work to understand if temperatures in particular are a key factor of air quality that are contributing to this relationship between air quality and cardiovascular disease risk. So we're going to deploy a high density residential temperature monitoring network within the Green Heart neighborhoods to understand if temperatures change residential temperature. If increasing trees changes residential temperatures. So we really want to be able to examine this on a residential temperature level. Next slide, please. So we have spent quite a bit of time to determine the appropriate placement of these temperature sensors. And so this is what we propose. So you see that there are brown circles or brown dots. That's where our existing monitor system is set up for air quality. So we want to co-locate temperature monitors there, but our research indicates that there's about a 300-meter range of influence. And so if we only locate at those existing locations, we won't necessarily have 300 meters in between each of our temperature sensors. So to get closer to that 300-meter range, we have also proposed adding in these starred locations. So there are 60 of the original locations of the air quality monitor sites. And we're adding about 30 to that. So we're going to have 90 monitors within this area to really be able to understand residential changes in temperatures and how that's related to cardiovascular disease risk. Next slide, please. So with that, I'm happy to take any questions about the Green Heart study during the chat. We highly encourage you to answer questions in the chat for myself or our next speaker, but I definitely want to thank our partners for their support along with the community and our great team of researchers here at University of Louisville. You can contact me with the information that's there on the slide. And with that, I'm pleased to introduce the next speaker. Next slide, please. So Mindy O'Neill. Mindy grew up in Iowa and moved to Alaska in 2004. As the executive director of the Cold Climate Housing Research Center, she works with a dynamic team to advance the mission of developing healthy, sustainable, and durable shelter for all circumpolar people. This enriching work spans the state, working with small villages, tribal organizations, and housing authorities, as well as international partners on innovative design and Arctic concepts for healthy and affordable housing options. Mindy serves as the presiding officer in her elected position on the Fairbanks North Star Borough Assembly. She earned a master's degree in communication from the University of Alaska Fairbanks, and with a focus in government networks and communications regarding relocation to Alaska Native villages due to climate change. In her spare time, she is seeking out trails with her puppy, Tito, or planning her next adventure to foreign lands. Mindy, you have the floor.
Thank you so much, Dr. DeJarnett. It is a pleasure to be with you today, and I'm excited to talk to you about what's happening in Fairbanks, Alaska. Next slide. You're looking at a photo of our facility in Fairbanks. We are located in the middle of Alaska, and it's considered an interior dry Arctic region. Next slide. Just a little bit about the Cold Climate Housing Research Center. We have been a part of Alaska. We've been here for about 20 years. We're a nonprofit that was actually started by the Home Builders Association here. And one builder in particular, Jack Hebert, our founder, was building homes in interior Alaska and really noticed that the construction was subpar to the conditions. And while the work of CCHRC has certainly affected commercial building and individual building of homes, the heart of our organization is in rural Alaska and indigenous communities to build healthy, durable, and sustainable shelter. Next slide. Our main programs, we have building science, policy and research, and sustainable northern communities. And I think of this as like the building science as really the research of the building envelopes, foundations, the different systems of how we can make construction of homes more efficient and adaptable to the conditions that we're in. The policy is kind of like the data crunching and the numbers, and how do we get the research to work in the regulations and conditions that we have within the state and in circumpolar regions. And then the sustainable northern communities is really where it all comes to life, where we're actually working with indigenous communities and incorporating traditional knowledge of Arctic living in our designs and our construction. I wanted to highlight our outreach and building education programs because we have quite a robust group of videos that are on our YouTube channel. Anything from insulation, flooring, and all the way up to any kind of commercial implementation or simple DIY suggestions for energy efficiency in your home. These are all available through that YouTube channel. Next slide, please. So Alaska's housing challenges are many. There are lots of issues that are here and compounded by the last 2 years of COVID and the increase of climate change. And, you know, the Arctic being kind of, we're often called the canary in the coal mine as to what's happening globally with climate change. But for the purposes of this discussion, I wanted to focus on the high energy costs, the housing resiliency in northern conditions and climate change, and unhealthy buildings that we are dealing with, and as that pertains to health. Next slide, please. So just to give you a really high view of Alaska's issues, in 2018, CCHRC paired up with Alaska Housing Finance Corporation, and they're mandated by the state to produce this housing assessment product that looks at the condition of housing within our state. And so we're undergoing a revision of that at the moment. So the latest we have is 2018. But at the time, we assessed that 55,000 homes were needed in the state in order to address the issues that we know exist. Poor energy use and you know, low use of star energy rating of homes. Overcrowding is a big issue. Mold due to moisture conditions is an issue. And as many communities in the country and around the world are facing, we have an aging population where designs of homes and locations really need to be looked at in another way. And of course, affordability is a key component there as well. Next slide, please. Looking at our, just to put another fine point on it, this information actually comes from the National Center for Healthy Housing, talking about the poor indoor air quality in more than half of homes in Alaska. And what we know is we have poor ventilation in most of these construction and houses, which leads to high moisture and toxic mold. It leads to respiratory disease, and the highest in the nation in Alaskan Natives are right here in Alaska. You know, the COVID-19 pandemic really highlighted the need for water and sanitation. And in rural Alaska, we know that 20% of Alaskan homes in rural Alaska are not piped for water or sewer. And as we do include piped systems, it increases, or I guess it decreases the amount of disease and infections by 16 to 38% because of running water. So we also know that toxic gases, and I highlighted that it says radio, but it should be radon. 21% of collected radon tests had levels above the EPA action level for indoor air quality, and that can be directly related back to building on top of soils with toxic gases. Next slide, please. So I wanted to just, you know, briefly touch on some of the conditions that we're dealing with in the Arctic for our problems related to housing and health, and highlight some of the solutions and success stories that have come out of the research and applied programs that we have here at CCHRC. One of them is this remote wall system. And this is a part of an effort to reduce our energy costs here by building efficient, durable building envelopes. And one of, we have a saying, build tight. And on the next slide, I'll show you what the rest of that saying is. Maybe you can try to guess it before we get there. But the remote wall system is really a coordinated effort to have an air barrier that protects the home, makes it a very tight home, but also allows ventilation. And this has been a popular design element that has been incorporated in building design across the state and the Arctic. Next slide, please. So there's that saying, build tight, ventilate right. And so we've really taken that saying to heart. This system here is another effort in reducing energy costs and by using heating and ventilation technologies. And so this is called our Breathe system. And essentially how this works is the HRV you can see at the bottom of the slide brings in fresh air. And as it passes through the HRV heat exchanger, it goes into rooms and recovers heat from the exhausted air. And so you can see that by one fire, two uses here, the boiler heats up this heat exchanger and heats the air as it comes in from the outside. So it's warm, fresh air. That same boiler provides enough energy to produce a movement for water. And that includes sink, faucet, shower, and washer. And so now within one system, you're able to provide heat, good ventilation, fresh air, as well as water and sanitation. So build right, ventilate, build tight, ventilate right. Next slide, please. Another component that we use here at the laboratory is this mobile test lab. And you can see the different panels here. Each of those panels are conducted with different types of technology and materials. And the whole point of this mobile test lab is to actually grow mold. And so we change the conditions and change the building materials to see what works best in keeping it home tight and preventing mold, and what products maybe to avoid when we're advising in building homes. Next slide, please. You've probably heard some about the need for village relocation in Alaska. It's a pervasive issue and it continues to loom for these mostly indigenous Alaska Native communities who are living on the cusp of climate change. So this is a picture taken from a plane, obviously, over a village called Newtok, which has since been relocated. You can see on the right-hand side the coastal erosion that is threatening the community, and really the need for the community to move. And one of the biggest things that happens when a village decides to relocate is that all investment at the old place stops. So next slide, please. What we try to do is think about, what does a building need to do before it arrives without any infrastructure? And so we need that water system, we need heat, we need ventilation and fresh air. And so a system like the Breathe system that we just highlighted is incorporated into a home like this, and fueled by a battery and an oil drip stove, so that there is lighting, there is water, and there is sanitation, there's heat. And this home can operate without the infrastructure needed that we would have in a rural or in an urban community. And ideally, those systems will be up and running as more homes are built and the community builds out, but that takes years and a lot of money. So these systems have really shown to work well. One system I didn't highlight, but is included as a pass system, and that is the ability for a toilet to separate liquids and solids, and then essentially compost into a chamber and separate the solid, where the odors escape out through the ventilation system, and the solid or the liquids are disposed of through a sanitation system. And so we've really got all of the systems and components of a house singularly involved in this one home that we've replicated. We call this a pioneer home. And so Newtok, when they moved, they chose a new name for their community called Matarvik or Muktavik. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned before, one of the core elements of CCHRC is that we incorporate local knowledge as a design input. Next slide. This is a picture of a home that was built in Quinnahock. And we used this and created this design after community outreach on how are they using their homes? What is the traditional knowledge? What is the cultural impacts that we can include in design to improve their quality of life and also the functionality of their home? And so you can see on the inside that there's space on the, there was space on the porch for space to harvest their subsistence use instead of bringing it into the kitchen table and harvesting a seal or a caribou. There's places for drying and storing subsistence foods. And then there's a very communal aspect to this home, which is important to that community and that culture. On the outside, the octagon shape reduces heating and wind loads. And so, lots of, you can imagine a pretty desolate area with lots of wind, lots of snow, and the potential for buildup if the house isn't actually built in the right condition placement. And so this octagon shape helps to reduce the amount of snow around the barrier of the home and protects the foundation and the side of the home, as well as allows for adequate ventilation to continue even during those heavy snow times. Next slide, please. So this is the outside of the home, and you can see how it is reduced, or how the snow is not built up around it. In the first year, 130 gallons of oil was used in the first winter, and that's a success story. Another component that CCHRC incorporates is instruction from our engineers, architects, designers, anthropologists, builders, and the use of local labor. So the community has bought into the design from the very beginning, and they are really leading how we interact with their community and what sort of output we have with them, all the way up to the construction of the home. The air is superior, and this was a structure that was built in 6 weeks. Next slide, please. This was a product that we recently published with the Alaska Native Tribal Health Consortium. It's called the Health and Safety Considerations in New Construction. And this came about because we were, watching kind of what was happening in Washington, D.C. with the Build Back Better and with the infrastructure bills. And this was way back when housing was actually included in those bills, but have, since been taken out and put into the Build Back Better bill, which doesn't seem to be moving. However, one of the historical traumas of our community, of our state, is is individuals coming from different parts of the world and building inadequate homes for our communities, which have lasted into decades and have caused lots of strife in communities. So a builder who's going to come from California and build a really great house that works in California doesn't work so well in Arctic Alaska, or even a rainforest of Alaska, or even in the interior. And so as we kind of watched the development of federal dollars again flooding into our state, we wanted to protect these communities in a way of guiding construction and highlighting some of the issues that I discussed earlier: the mold, the ventilation, the foundation, permafrost melting, all of these different sort of climate issues that are happening we wanted to produce a guideline for builders. And, what's funny is we started this as a one pager and it's 33 pages. So it's quite in depth, but it is a handy resource for anybody who's looking to build construction in Alaska. And this is available for free on our website, cchrc.org. Next slide, please. So with that, yes, happy to answer any questions. Please visit our YouTube channel. It's a wealth of information. And if you want to go down a couple rabbit trails, you will be sure to find some there. It's quite interesting, and just appreciate the opportunity to participate in this forum today, in this extremely important issue. Thanks.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Mindy, for an excellent presentation. And we'll transition now into the question and answer portion. The next slide, please. And so I love how you shared the importance. Oh, and Mindy, we can both keep our cameras on for the Q&A. I love how you shared the importance of the engagement of the community and how that was critical to the success of the work that's taking place there in Alaska. And I think that's something that simply cannot be underscored enough. And I think that's something that also contributes to the work of the project, the Green Heart Louisville project here, because it's something that the communities called for. They said, we want more trees, and we were able to meet that need and able to do that through a health research study as well. But being able to have community-driven, community-led work is of great importance. What were some of the challenges that you may have run into in community engagement, and how did you overcome some of those challenges?
Great question. I think one of the challenges that stick out to me the most is how we really have a westernized framework of how we approach, dealing with issues that typically the federal government is involved in, and how that really doesn't quite work for our community. So, for example, if a community is applying for a grant, typically you do that through the internet. And we don't have internet in a lot of places here in Alaska. And if we do, it's extremely expensive and prohibitive. So if there are, let's say, competitive grants or competitive applications that need to go in, and, it opens up for only 3 hours or something, that may be a time that the community is in school. And so the rest of the community is unable to use the internet. So something as simple as that, like that's just somewhere we can start. But the challenges are vast in working. I would say logistics is another big issue. Actually getting construction materials. Many times we have to coordinate with barges up rivers. And so that's weather dependent. And there's only maybe 2 or 3 times that happens a year. And so you really have to be planning years in advance to have a project, know what sort of materials you need, know where it needs to be sourced from, usually in Seattle for us, and get it on a barge. Now that's only if there's enough room and if you can afford to put it on there. So that's just where we could start.
Oh, wonderful. Thank you. Thanks for sharing the insights and expertise. And there's another question here that's specific for you, Mindy. Considering the high housing costs in the U.S., how are these housing modifications being financed for working and middle income class families?
They're mostly being financed through grants, through federal grants. There are partnerships with the state of Alaska, but we're working on some ways to get the costs down by using local resources, by supporting communities in developing like local sawmills in their areas, so we can actually manufacture and produce the lumber that we're able to use. So the funding sources are typically federal for the most part. There's some involvement with communities, but for the most part, that's where the funding is coming from.
Great, thank you. And that's certainly a key aspect of this. One of the issues that we've run into in terms of tree planting. So we have these trees and we're ready to plant them. And there are some people that say, we don't want trees. And so we surveyed to understand why some people may not want trees. And some expressed a concern of the maintenance costs, maintenance aspects, and how those costs could stack up, when it comes to having a tree and being able to maintain trees or additional trees. And so one thing that we've done is, in partnership with our city government, we have representatives in our city government and beyond, and we have a tree assistance fund where people can apply for funds to support maintenance activities related to the trees. And then we also tried to get trees that are low maintenance. So we didn't get trees that bear leaves for the residential planting, so that we could cut back on maintenance and any additional burden that would be imposed by having to rake leaves, for example. So there's one more question, and we'll probably be rounding out with this question that I want to share with you that came through the Q&A. This is big picture. And so the quote is, one of the problems is that policymakers don't consider environmental health to be an essential service like the police or fire department. How would you propose to change this? And then, does Louisville or Fairbanks have a cold or heat officer like some cities around the country? So I'll turn that to you, Mindy.
No, we do not have that. And in fact, that's a brand new concept to me. So that is, I learned something today, and that's a really great idea to incorporate. I don't know how we change the sense of urgency on a policy level, except for including it in everything that we do and we say. I mean, this is not a problem that we're going to be able to run away from. It's going to impact pocketbooks, it's going to impact taxes, and that's really where people start to pay the most attention, in my opinion, when it starts to cost money. So it's already costing us money, it's costing us health, and it's costing us money in ways that we're not even accounting for. So I think just the more that we include that in all the work that we do, the more that culture takes on. I'd be interested to hear what you have going on.
Oh, thank you. No, I think this question is big enough to be its own webinar, how to prioritize environmental health services as essential. When we know that they're essential, we have a very invested interest in this space that sees the value of environmental health services in a number of ways. I think what's important is that we can continue to engage in multi-sectoral partnerships and collaboratives, and make sure that environmental health is at the table, weighing in on things that impact environmental health that we're not usually involved in that decision making and discussing, but making sure that environmental health is at the table and continuing to raise the voice of environmental health successes, like the work that you have in Fairbanks and what you've been able to accomplish. Showcasing these successes, I think, is critical to helping shed a light on the benefit of environmental health services as well. But I really do think we could take another hour and delve in even deeper on this. And I think it's worthy of that conversation. But it has been absolutely wonderful to speak with you today, to learn about what's happening in Fairbanks and Fairbanks, and to have the opportunity to share the work that we're doing here in Louisville, Kentucky. So we've learned about protections from extreme cold and extreme heat. I thank the audience for your time as well, and certainly thank NEHA and NCHH for hosting this great discussion series. So with that, I'll turn it back to Anna, who will do an advertisement of the developed the resources as well, and share the upcoming webinar. So Anna, you have the floor, and thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you so much to you, Natasha, and also to you, Mindy, for your great presentations. Sarah, you can go ahead to the next slide. Also, just wanted to quickly thank you to our participants for joining us today and for your questions and continuing the conversation. So as we wrap up today, you'll just see on your screen some resources we've gathered from CDC and others about centering equity and environmental justice and climate work. We just wanted to take a moment to highlight these resources and note that there are many others out there about these important topics. Next slide. So next, I just wanted to point to some new and upcoming resources from NCHH that are a product of this partnership and of this project. So we've published resource libraries on hurricanes and high wind events, and also on extreme heat, with our extreme cold resource library coming soon. These resource libraries are intended for residents and provide guidance on how to stay safe and healthy before, during, and after these extreme weather events. And as always, we're approaching these topics with a healthy housing lens. Next on the list, you can see the recording and link to our first webinar in the series. And then lastly there, just be on the lookout for some upcoming companion resources. Those will be companion resources to the resource libraries on those three main topics, and those will be coming later this summer. Next slide. So just in closing, you can find those resources, the upcoming ones, and then also the ones we've already published on our emergency preparedness and response webpage, and the bit.ly is there on your screen. Next slide. Also, just wanted to remind you again, our next webinar in this series will be coming this July and exploring topics of climate resilience and healthy housing. So be on the lookout for that in the next couple months. Next slide. So with that, I just want to thank you again, and I'll turn it over to Chris to close us out.
Thank you, Anna, and thank you, Natasha, as well as Mindy, for great presentations. This concludes our webinar. Please join us in July when we advertise for our third webinar of this three-part series. As well, please do provide feedback on the survey that you should find on the end of this webinar. So thank you for attending, and enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you. Have a great day.